formally, I'm going to turn it over to Drs. Miriam Rafferty and Sarah Helseth, who will be leading us in a discussion about sustaining and scaling. Miriam was one of the founding members of this reading course and was the co-director last year. And Sarah's new faculty at the Center for Dissemination and Implementation Science. And we're absolutely thrilled that they are here with us today to talk with us about this important topic. You wonderful women can take it away.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I do also feel compelled, beyond saying, hi, everybody, I am the other Sarah in the Center for Dissemination and Implementation Science. And right before we started this conversation, we all realized on the planning committee that Miriam and I look not only similar in our pictures with our red shirts, but also today we're both wearing these deep kind of fall colors. So I think it really shows that we're very aligned on the things that we're going to be talking about today. So today we're going to be talking to you about this concept of sustainment and on the concept of scaling out. This is the agenda that we're going to be going through today, and we'll periodically check in with it. Additionally, I'm not going to spend time reiterating the readings for this week's course, but I did want to remind everyone of the concepts in action paper written by Miriam and colleagues. And I also wanted to highlight the corresponding textbook pages and chapters we recommended as optional readings, as one of them includes adaptations. And I think that that is especially relevant to what we're going to be talking about today. Additionally, I wanted to remind everybody of those course objectives that we talked about at the very beginning of this course so many weeks ago. And I wanted to remind you that we're hoping for today's session to address these beginner level competencies. So as we read in this week's readings, sustainment is really conceptualized as a dynamic process. When we're talking about some of these different definitions that come up, thinking about what happens after the implementation support is withdrawn, there are some different concepts that are overlapping, but still distinct. So first we have maintenance, which is the extent to which a program is maintained or continued over time. Clinically, I think about maintenance as an individual outcome where we think about a maintained behavior change over a period of time. But in implementation science, we can also think about it from the setting level, which would be the maintained implementation of a novel practice or program. Something to think about when we're talking about maintenance is that there oftentimes can be a push to institutionalize the program or the practice. But as we read about today, there is a real need for ongoing implementation to be dynamic. And so if you institutionalize, make it routine or policy, you run the risk of the program becoming static and therefore difficult to change, meaning that you may not incorporate, the current evidence or contextual factors that change or, policies that influence that particular practice. Beyond that, we have the definition of sustainment, which was brought around by Moore and colleagues. And they conceptualized sustainment as being at least 2 years, which is a really long time in the life of an implementation project. And as a result, up until the past few years, sustainment hasn't really been measured in a lot of our implementation trials. We plan for it, but we don't necessarily assess it, which Miriam will be talking about later on in today's presentation. The things that are important to consider about the process of sustainment is that the program or the individual behavior can evolve or adapt. And oftentimes we would say that sometimes it should be, able to evolve or adapt, because ultimately the goal of sustainment is that it continues to produce benefits for the individuals or the systems with whom or for whom you are implementing this practice. And I did also want to touch on, we'll see if this pops up. Aha, there it is. So sustainability is a word that you'll hear oftentimes earlier in the implementation process. And I think that's because, like I mentioned, they're all related terms. But in this case, sustainability is really the potential for sustainment. So when you're designing an implementation strategy or when you're designing an intervention, you should be asking yourself, can this be sustained? What would be needed for this to be sustained in a given context? And because we're talking about it so early in the process, rather than when we're actually measuring sustainment, we do use a different term for that, and it is called sustainability. So I wanted to talk a little bit about where sustainment fits within this process of implementation. So EPIS is one process model, which a process model is a way that we can break down the steps involved in the process of change to be more manageable. And it can also sometimes include explanatory factors. So EPIS defines sustainment as a goal to realize the continued benefits of a practice or program being implemented. And I really like that conceptualization because it means that it should be something that we think about throughout the implementation planning process. And I think a really great example of this is that we should all think to ourselves about the last time that we tried to start a project or implement a change in our own lives. When you were thinking about making that change, were you thinking about how you would sustain that change after you've made it? Or was it all just about how you were going to make the change in the first place? And about really intentionally planning for that change. So too often we start projects and we assume that they're going to just naturally sustain and that our motivation is going to stay the same over time and that nothing outside that could impact our ability to succeed is going to change. But that's really not the case. In addition, EPIS encourages us to consider what ongoing structures, what processes, or what implementation supports might be needed. And then additionally, what adaptations may be needed as we progress through the process of sustaining and then continuing to refine the intervention or the practice. This is another process model that accounts for sustainment. It's called the knowledge to action model. Miriam's going to be talking about it later in her case example, so I wanted to just lay some groundwork here. So the triangle in the center represents knowledge creation, and the exterior steps all reflect the steps that are involved in the action cycle. So knowledge and then action. And as you can see here, the knowledge to action cycle overlaps really nicely with EPIS, with the EPIS around the cycle. All of the process models are kind of going through the same steps, but the knowledge to action model cycle model really nicely breaks down some of the steps within that phase of sustainment. So specifically, it encourages you to assess barriers to sustainability, and then tailor the intervention and your implementation strategies to these barriers, while acknowledging the need to potentially evolve and adapt the intervention and your implementation strategies over time, to ensure that knowledge is not changing, or that knowledge is changing and you're incorporating those changes. You should be monitoring knowledge use in an ongoing fashion, and then also evaluate initial and sustained use. And again, not to hammer the point home too hard, but really what this model emphasizes is that it's best to consider sustaining early in the process of developing an implementation strategy, but also throughout the process of implementing. The last comparison I wanted to provide was with the dynamic sustainability framework, which I have to say, I really enjoyed preparing for this presentation because rereading the papers by Chambers and Shelton had me sitting in my chair and cheering, because the big point that I took home from these is that change is inevitable and we can't design things to exist in a vacuum and just accept that the best outcomes we can expect are only going to occur in those very highly controlled environments. We want to make sure that as we're delivering things out in the community or out in, real world contexts, we're actively managing the fit between an intervention and its context so that we can continue to optimize those benefits over time. So we're thinking about changes to the intervention and the context, and then really, I think the Shelton paper used this term of evolvability. And I loved that term because it recognizes this need to kind of adapt and change as things change and shift. So it talked about ongoing optimization, collecting stakeholder feedback and using that feedback to guide refinements, And then if you do have to engage in adaptations, which I shouldn't even say if, it's when, you should either plan for fidelity consistent adaptations, or if you get feedback and you need to make a refinement or change something about your program in an unplanned manner, you should make sure that you document those changes really carefully. And here are two examples of some adaptation frameworks that can be really helpful. And I think the thing that I love the most about these works is that they really demonstrate that this is intended to be a process. All of them have arrows going in circles. They all reflect cycles, because implementation is really not an endpoint. It's a journey, so to speak. And then finally, I wanted to share this table because I think that it provides a really nice summary of the shift in mindset that can be required when you're coming from an efficacy or effectiveness research, like that real RCT mindset, and then you're shifting to an implementation mindset where adaptation is not a bad thing. It's something that we anticipate and plan for and account for, where we're assessing context and outcomes in an ongoing manner. We're reviewing the evidence, not just from efficacy studies, but also from other sources that could influence our work. And staffing issues, I love this one because every time we talk about workforce turnover with our collaborators, it seems to be such a thing that they fear and they stress, but it's part of implementing in the real world. People are going to change and contexts are going to change. So instead of letting that make us afraid or not accounting for it, let's plan for it. Let's assess it. Let's capture it and see how it impacts our ability to implement something. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is scaling out. And I should have put or scaling up because I think they're really similar concepts, but they are approached from kind of a different perspective. So on the one hand, we have scaling up, and scaling up involves taking the intervention or the practice that you want to deliver, and you're delivering it to new and similar contexts. So we're not really as concerned about effectiveness because we're kind of making the fundamental assumption that the contexts are similar enough that it should continue to be as effective in these similar contexts. It can involve the same or different implementation strategies. And it's really about taking a thing and going big and delivering it to as many of that type of population and as many of that type of context as possible. I wanted to also make note that it's related to the concept of diffusion, which is the natural spread of things, or dissemination, which is the more effortful and intentional spread of things. In contrast, we have scaling out. Scaling out's a little bit trickier because instead of taking something and going big, you're taking something and spreading it out, and you are adapting potentially or slightly modifying the implementation strategies. And that's because you're delivering the practice or the intervention or something on which it is based to new and different contexts. And some things to note about scaling out is that sometimes it can require increased resources. So you might need to invest more financial capital or time in order to expand coverage and access to this intervention or practice. We recognize that because the context is different and because either the population or the setting is different, we can't necessarily rely on prior effectiveness research because we're changing a pretty big component of the practice or the intervention. However, we recognize that you can look to established intervention, you can look to the prior literature of the effectiveness trials and use that to accelerate translation because sometimes things are similar, but there are contextual factors that do require accounting for and adapting to, but not to the point that it's so disparate from the existing literature that you can't really look back to it to inform your decision making. So I wanted to provide two quick examples of scaling up versus scaling out. So for scaling up, I literally Googled scaling up and I found this World Health Organization example where they took their mental health gap action program to mental health and substance use treatment clinics in a wide range of low and middle income countries. So what I thought was really lovely about this is that when I Googled the intervention on their site, it pulled up all these articles demonstrating how they are trying to deliver this program in Syria, in Mexico, in Guinea, in the Philippines. And they're really talking about a packaged program, and they're delivering it in a range of contexts that are very similar in terms of their resources and the populations that they're serving. In contrast, scaling out is about taking something and bringing it to a broader range of people, adapting where needed. So in this case, it was a tobacco use intervention for adolescents. However, adolescents who live in Appalachia don't have the same accessibility. Obviously, they run into not having as many service providers in their area, or maybe they can't afford it, or they can't get transportation to clinics. And so in this context, the researchers were talking about the need to take a packaged program that was meant to be delivered in person and scale it out to be delivered virtually so that it can increase access to and utilization of this intervention in an underserved population. So something that I thought was really lovely as I was looking for these examples is that many of the times we're talking about scaling out can be related to improving health equity and increasing access to interventions that maybe weren't designed for a specific population, but for whom they could still benefit with some minor adjustments to align with their contextual demands, their population demands, and potentially also some cultural adaptations that might be needed. So when you think about scaling out, you should really conceptualize it as kind of an off-label use of psychiatric medication, for example. And something that I wanted to mention from the Aaron's article is that he talked about 3 types of scale out. The first was looking at a different delivery system, but the same population. The second was looking at a different population, but the same delivery system. And the third was looking at different populations and delivery systems. And I did want to really highlight that type 3 can be especially tricky when you're trying to balance fidelity and the evidence base, if you're adapting the way something is being delivered and the people for whom or to whom it is being delivered. So when you're considering going the scale out route, be really thoughtful about how big of a step you're taking relative to the evidence base, because we want to make sure that we're not removing those components that are really effective and that are really driving the changes in behavior for individuals or providers. But we also want to make sure that we're increasing access to these interventions that are effective. All right, I'm going to hand it off to my wonderful colleague, Miriam.
Great, thanks for setting it up. I hopefully now everybody is on the same page in terms of all the definitions and the terminology. So I will be moving into assessment tools. Go ahead and next slide. So the people that developed REAIM, Glasgow and Chambers, and then Shelton, Rachel Shelton came along and she did a really nice job pulling REAIM into the new era, kind of the post 2020 era. And what she did in her article on REAIM was to basically, how do we bring sustainability through the REAIM process into each of the different outcomes, the reach, effectiveness, adoption, et cetera. So she highlights that your implementation process is going to be iterative, both as a process and as a measurement system. So iterative measurement means a lot of times you might be repeating the same measurement over and over with time. She, as Sarah mentioned, highlighted the evolvability of your program and that every program should be dynamic, and that what we can do as implementation researchers or as implementation practitioners is really plan for how you're going to make adaptations over time. When we write a grant, we might say like, and this might change over time, and we will be sure that we report it using rigorous adaptation and modification terminology. And so plan for making those adaptations from the beginning. She also highlights how important it is to think about the adaptations that reflect the diverse settings and cultures and populations that we could be working with, and how we could make sure that we're addressing equity and costs for each of these. Is reach equitable? What are the costs of reaching more populations? Is adoption equitable? And what are the costs of adopting in different types of settings or for a longer period of time? Whenever you're repeating measurement of any outcomes, if you start to see that something is actually not as effective as you thought it would be, you might need to plan for de-implementing, whether you're de-implementing something that you thought would be effective and it turns out it isn't. And so you need to kind of course correct, or perhaps if you're implementing new things, what can you de-implement to take the burden off of the clinicians who just frequently, in our setting, at least, we always hear like, you keep adding more things for us to document without taking anything away. So make sure that you think about de-implementation as well. And one of the nice things about the REAIM article that was a part of your reading this week is that it kind of layers in the other determinant frameworks and other kind of contextual factors and frameworks throughout the process. It kind of recognizes that you're not just using REAIM, you're tagging on a lot of like CFR might be involved, a process model would be involved. And so they do kind of do a nice job of working that through the REAIM system. Next slide. So in addition to repeating your REAIM measurement over time, there's a number of other assessment tools that are out there for sustaining and scaling. And the ones that I'll talk about the most, I'll talk a little bit more about sustainability measures, because so many of our projects, as Sarah mentioned, we're really working on a grant on a shorter timeline. So your outcome of your grant might just be that you have something that other people rate as being sustainable. You might not have the opportunity to measure it for another 2 years to show that it was sustained. So the NHS sustainability model is what's pictured here at the right. It has 3 domains: processes. So are the processes sustainable? Staff and how your staff are trained and engaged, is that sustainable? And is it sustainable from the organization perspective? Then there's the 10 constructs within those 3 domains. And I really liked this tool. The link there is the institute.nhs.uk sustainability link. Unfortunately, it wasn't really published and validated in the peer-reviewed literature. It was like kind of like within the NHS system. So while many studies have used it, it's a little bit less rigorous on the psychometric properties. Kind of to balance off of that are the program sustainability assessment tool and the clinical sustainability assessment tool, which were developed by a group at Washington University in St. Louis, I believe. And these have been more rigorously there was like a development article published with the psychometrics of the scales, and they are out in my next slide. I'll talk a little bit about how they differ, but they're more rigorous, but they're newer, and I'll talk a little bit of my example about how they're used. I don't personally find them quite as helpful. The sustainment measurement system scale is another tool that came out of collaborations here with Dr. Brown and others that really relates to programs or prevention programs and what's been published in the past. How are people measuring these? And then the final one is the intervention scalability assessment tool, and the link to that article is down below as well. So I just wanted to make sure you guys had the links of some of these tools so you could go and explore them in more detail on your own. The next slide. When you're picking your tool, it's important to think about what you're trying to sustain. Are you sustaining a community program, or are you sustaining a clinical intervention? And the reason for that is because they are different. And this really came to light in that WashU's group, how they developed the program sustainability assessment tool. You'll see that the domains there: environmental support, funding stability, partnership, organizational capacity, communications, and strategic planning. While all of these are important in a clinical setting, there's a lot of things I don't have a lot of control over, like strategic planning for my whole organization. Like my little programs are such a small piece of that it's not always the most important thing. The clinical sustainability assessment tool does, though. When I read those domains and I go into those questions, I'm like, oh yes, these are the things I want to measure in my clinical programs. So think about what it is you're trying to measure. Go ahead, next slide. So now I'm going to kind of give an example of putting these sustainability assessment tools to use. Next slide. And this one, as Sarah mentioned, the KTA cycle, you can click through about 3 times. I believe, I talked before, we layer in the barriers and facilitators to implementation. We've got the evaluation, And then we kind of when we first did the study, we went through a second cycle. We did all of these same things again, except instead of now doing barriers and facilitators to implementation, we were looking at barriers and facilitators to sustainability. And then we looked at the evaluation of sustainability or sustainment. And we used the NHS sustainability model initially. Next slide. So when we repeated our outcome measures, we had initially started our program in 2016, and then we did a variety of evaluations using pulling data from different sources. So our repeated re-aim has data from 2018 and 2019, and you'll see that our reach to the patients increased in absolute numbers of patients. 38 patients were referred, and then it grew to 133 patients who were referred. But it was important to look at what our denominator was, because the referring clinic grew as well. So we did see an increased percent of patients reached, but not quite as like eye-opening as just looking at the pure N. So 25% to 36%. If I was redoing this now after the Rachel Shelton paper, I would also be describing to you the characteristics of these patients, including their race and ethnicity and their age. So it's nice to kind of reflect and think what we can do better. And what we can continue to improve. So hopefully that will be in my 7-year or 8-year evaluation paper instead of my 4-year evaluation paper. In effectiveness, we had a slight increase in the number of patients who reported more exercise following participating in our program. So that means our therapists are still doing a great job. Adoption, we saw more referrers were referring to us, and more of the people who were referred to us attended the session, because there's always, you refer people into a specialty service, there's always some attrition. And how are we better capturing those people? And whether it's being more convenient to where they live, maybe they didn't want to come down. The first year we learned that some people didn't want to come downtown. So we, in our sustainability assessment, we learned that, well, they wanted more suburban clinics. Great. So in addition to sustainment, we are going to scale up so that our suburban clinics have this clinical offering as well. And that what turned out to be, I think, a really good move for both scaling and reaching more people, as well as sustainment. And then in implementation, people were still implementing with fidelity, greater than 85%, and maintenance was basically just this whole looking at the R, E, A, and I repeatedly over time. Next slide. And then this gets into the sustainability assessments. So if you focus your attention on the left, this is NHS sustainability model. We have staff, processes, and organization. Anything in purple, I want to draw your eyes to the purple first. Northwestern purple, clinical leadership, 15 out of 15. We were doing awesome in clinical leadership. We had 7 out of 7 fit with goals and culture. But there are some things that have decidedly lower scores. And so we decided that those are going to be places that we put our attention to. So the staff behavior, which is about training and education and kind of how they collaborate and communicate with each other, senior leadership, making sure that we're sharing the benefits beyond the patients. As a clinical researcher, I'm really interested in helping our patients. As an organization sustainment person, I need to think about how referral rates might be increasing for our organization, that we're capturing patients into our system of care and keeping them there. This is a business mindset. But it's really important for sustainability. If you have a program you want to keep around, it needs to be efficient and effective. And then we can always continue to improve our infrastructure. So we saw some solid things to work on, which, I'm happy for the feedback. We're always going to make improvements. On the right, though, you see our CSAT scores, as clinical sustainability and assessment tools. And this one was everything scored on a scale of 1 to 7. It's kind of your standard Likert scale, which makes more sense. From a psychometrics property, you see where that makes sense compared to having a max score of 11.4 on something. I don't even understand what's going on with NHS scoring, but that's what it is. But with CSAT, we also had good engaged staff and leadership. So that was a strength in both. Outcomes and effectiveness was a strength there. But the things that were weaknesses, if you just looked at the scores, it was hard to see. But we just picked up anything that was below a 6 out of 7. Now on a Likert scale, a 5.7 and a 5.9 aren't really that low. So I have concerns with the CSAT about its a potential for a ceiling effect, and the developers acknowledge that in their manuscript. So this is nothing new to them, but you do kind of have to find your opportunities for improvement a little bit more there. And I think this is still a very early field. So I think stay tuned to this. And I encourage you guys to look at the questions in both, in any assessment tool you're considering, look at the assessment tools and try to figure out which one is going to give you actionable information that you would be able to use. So I found them both helpful, but I personally like the NHS sustainability model better. Next slide. So a couple other little kind of comparisons between the assessments. The NHS sustainability model, despite its really weird scoring, they do provide a cutoff score, which is kind of nice, that if you score over a 55 or equal to or above a 55 out of 100 on it, that you can kind of say that there's a high potential for your program to be sustainable. So my program scored an overall score of 71 with like kind of towards the end of the first year into the second year, and it has now been sustained for 7 years. So so far so good. And I really liked the questions, although with the scoring is weird, it forces you, instead of picking and rating something on a Likert scale, it's more of a multiple choice thing. So it gives you like 4 options, and which one of these 4 options best describes your program. So it's a little bit more complicated of a scale, but it really gives you actionable information, I think. The benefit of the CSAT is that it does have established reliability and validity in peer-reviewed publications, and those are not present for the NHS sustainability model. And but we do have those concerns that I've mentioned already. Next slide. I did mention in the other assessment slide that there's a scalability assessment as well, and I have not used that one personally, but I think it'll be really fun to start playing around with it more. What I will mention for our organization, at least, scaling was really important to consider while at the same time as sustaining, because if you have a big like multi-site, your organization has a lot of small satellite sites, then the more your program is integrated kind of like tentacle-like throughout the organization, the more likely it is to sustain. And so scaling to the suburban sites was something that was a barrier to implementation and then a barrier to sustaining. And so once we scaled, initially you might think it's going to be hard if you scale because that creates work and it adds more people. But I think it has helped us with our sustaining because it's helped us think through institutionalizing processes that otherwise you might have just had 1 or 2 people at one site doing something. But now there's like a whole organization-wide effort that this program is going to continue to be used. And the other, that was scaling up the exact same intervention in, same organization, but just slightly different, suburban small site versus a big site, an academic site. But interestingly, it's also just organically scaled out, and that we've gotten referrals not for Parkinson's disease. We get referrals for Huntington's disease. And, it's a neurodegenerative condition, but it's different. And then now we're getting referrals for lupus and MS. And these are very different conditions, but where the doctors throughout Northwestern or like our friends and colleagues are referring for the myositis is another one. Like these are like rare conditions where there aren't a lot of options for the patients, and the physicians hear about this model and think their patients would benefit from it. And I think that it's another thing to consider is that it strengthens our Parkinson's program when other people want a program like it for their diagnosis. So just kind of always being open to the scaling and how it can help. Next slide. If you want to learn more, there's lots of scaling and sustaining out there in the internet. So we talked a lot about Rachel Shelton's article that you guys read. She does a really nice presentation on it. She's actually done a lot of really nice presentations on it. So I encourage you to go hear about it from the person themselves. And then the dynamic sustainability, again, if you're interested in that, the dynamic sustainability framework, I recommend listening to David Chambers talk about it himself. And there's a really nice recorded lecture on the Learn P2C site, and then another one there for sustainability and de-implementation, which I feel like every once in a while we say the word without going into it, but Rachel Shelton does a very nice talk on de-implementation as well. Next slide. I think just kind of finalizing some announcements before we break out.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. So we wanted to announce for the big group a reminder that because of the Memorial Day holiday, our next meeting is not for 3 weeks. And we would like to announce a change in structure to that meeting. So that meeting is about funding, dissemination, and implementation, research, and practice. We recognize that topic may be of interest to all, but may not. And so if people prefer not to come to that one, you are welcome not to if you don't see issues of funding as relevant to your work. We do encourage you to come though, because we will try to make it as inclusive as possible. But the biggest announcement is that we will not break out into breakout groups that day. We will have a guest lecturer, Renad Betis, speaking with Dennis Lee and Kelly Scott about resources here at Northwestern. And rather than breaking into breakout groups, we'd like to use the full hour for people to ask questions of the speakers and of each other, so that we can all benefit from expertise in different types of grant mechanisms, which might not be available if we were to divide into breakout groups. Our last meeting, this is a big change. It was supposed to be on the 12th, and we apologize. We know that people may have planned their schedules already, but due to unforeseen issues that are going to take 3 members of our planning committee away and unable to be here, including our logistical magician, Emma, and myself and Dennis, we are going to ask that we postpone. The 19th is Juneteenth, so we cannot meet on that day. So we're going to ask to postpone until the 26th. That is just a wrap up. There will be no formal didactics. It's a time for you to come and ask any dissemination and implementation questions you might have. We will prompt you to think about questions once or twice via email between the 5th and the 26th. And we really encourage you to come that day. We're going to have a long list of questions and we'll go through it as a full group together. So again, please stay tuned, and just today will be your last time with your wonderful, vibrant breakout groups. So we really hope that you enjoy the next 20 minutes all together with your groups. And anything else anyone would like to add before we break?
I actually might add one thing, just to give everybody a heads up. You all completed a survey when you were initially registering for the course. And so I just wanted to put on your radar that after that final wrap up, we're going to be sending out a follow-up survey. Just like all of the folks who have been doing this important sustainment work we've been talking about, we want to make sure that we're getting feedback from you on what you liked, what you didn't like, refining the course for the future, seeing how you feel the course has impacted your knowledge of implementation science, and then ask you some questions about things we're considering doing as potential next steps. So please keep an eye out for that coming from us sometime in June.